Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Buff Naggle the podcast, where we explore entertaining and enlightening discussions of the adventure of life and all things good. From science and technology to history and philosophy to leadership and success. We hope to give you a better understanding of the world and skills for everyone to pursue their own adventure. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Buff Naggle the podcast, where we talk about all things good in the pursuit of the adventure of life. I'm Zach, and we got a fantastic show today. We're going to be looking at a little more of Marco Polo's adventures into Asia and what we learned from that, what he learned from that, and what, the world learned from that. However, I can't do this alone because, I never really studied Marco Polo. So I'm bringing in the expert, Rafe. Rafe,
Nice.
How are you doing today?
Zach, let me put up my air quotes too. I'm fantastic. No, I'm doing great. I'm doing great here as the expert here on Marco Polo. I am. Autumn has arrived, Zach, and that is a happy time for me because you know how I love stepping on dried up leaves and making them make a crunchy sound. Did you know that?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
You also like to take your wet feet and to make squeaky sounds when you walk around places.
I do that at like a Target and stuff like that. Yeah. Okay. Well, hey, listeners, thank you. All right. Thanks for being here. Thanks for listening regularly. We appreciate you. All jocularity aside, which would be pretty much this whole show aside, we appreciate you having you there listening to us and signing in and giving us your feedback. As always, you can reach us at buffnaggle@buffnaggle.com. We're on Twitter, Instagram, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, Stitcher, all sorts of other places. We are a global top 10% podcast, and that's kind of a cool thing, and that's all thanks to you. If you are new here to the podcast and you're wondering, where am I and how did I get here? What am I going to do? Well, we're glad you're here, all right? Give us 4 episodes, and we will give you a reason to come back for more. We're talking about all sorts of different things. Today it's Marco Polo. Tomorrow, maybe zebras. I don't really have any idea, but we'll come up with something that will resonate with you. And remember, tell a friend to listen, and you will get a free episode. Hit the subscribe button, the follow button, the tell us when there's new buff stuff button, and your life will be wonderful. Zach, we left Marco Polo in Asia a couple weeks ago.
We did. We dropped him off in Asia. We said, hey, hang out here for a bit. We'll be back in a couple of weeks to catch up with you. And, lots of catching up to do. If you remember last time when we were talking about Marco Polo and the Mongols, we were talking a lot about the Mongolian Empire itself, the span of it, how big it was, how long it lasted, and kind of the political and military prowess of that empire that reached into Europe at a point in time, and then by reaching into Europe, made the Europeans and the Western world realize, hey, maybe we need to explore this Asia place a little bit more.
Yeah, and there were a number of I guess, forays or expeditions into Asia to meet these Mongols and find out what they needed to try to convert them. When you spend like 3 years between contact, right? You write a letter, you put it on a guy's back, you drive him out there, and he writes a letter back. I mean, it's difficult to get things done, but there were some east-west interactions. But the guys who really opened it up were the Polos. And the last time when we left our friends, the 2 Polo brothers, Marco's dad and Marco's uncle, they are Mafio and Nicolo. They took Marco with them out to meet the Great Khan, and they met him out in the middle of Mongolia. And that's where we left you. And it turns out that Marco spent a long time out there with the Great Khan. He learned 4 languages. He became a special envoy of the Khan, and he became so close to the Khan, Zach, that the other lords were moved to envy. Right? He was like the special golden child there in the court, and the Khan sent him on missions all around Asia. And he came back with all sorts of colorful tales and descriptions of places he had been and things he had seen. He was there for 17 years, and then the Polos returned home. The Khan sent them home with one of these tablets that says, leave this guy alone. He's my buddy, right? And they came back through Persia and they made it back after about 20 years gone altogether. So in 1925, in 1295, 24 years after leaving, they finally made it back to Venice, all right, which is in Italy, of course. And Marco got thrown into prison. He got thrown into a Genoese prison in 1298, 3 years later, because like these little city states, they were cities and they were states, and so they were always at war with each other. Milan was at war with Genoa and with Rome and with Tuscany and with Venice. I mean, they were all fighting each other all the time. And Marco got thrown into jail. He met this guy named Rustichello, and Rustichello was the guy who wrote the first edition of Marco's book.
Yeah, so Marco, he comes back from hanging out with the Khans, which, if you think about it, a European hanging out with the Khans, an Asian military, strong, emperorish group, and then he goes back to Italy and he hangs out with a bunch of city-states and he hands himself in jail. Like, yeah. Thanks, Italy.
Yeah, so he gets thrown into jail because they're all at war with each other, right? And he and this Rustichello guy meet in prison, and they write
most great things. When you go to prison, sometimes something great comes from it. MLK wrote a letter from Birmingham jail, in prison, and then Hitler wrote Mein Kampf from prison as well. And there have been plenty of other historical notes written from prison or prison type things. Galileo, a lot of his later works on the solar system and the sun and the moon and all of that stuff came from when he was technically in prison, which was a form of house arrest after the Catholic Church said, you can't really say these things. But we can get into that.
That's a different one. But, Paul wrote some of his letters from prison. So, Zach, we should go to prison. We should write.
Let me know how that goes for you.
Yeah. Well, okay. So it turns out, though, that Marco Polo wasn't the first guy from the West to meet the Khans. Okay. In 1261, there's some records of people who they called the Franks, essentially the people from the West. And if you read the records that the Khan, the chroniclers in the East wrote about the West, they wrote that the West was an exotic place. And what's interesting is, from their perspective, the West was exotic. And from the perspective of the West, the East was exotic. So both of them had that view of each other. And, what it really takes is somebody to write down not the exotic, bizarre things about, men without heads with faces in the middle of their chest, or some, guys with wings or something like that. You have to write it down the right way. And that's what Marco Polo did with Rustichello.
And then if you think about it as well, a lot of stereotypes of the Eastern people, Asian people, came from what they took and they saw in their spirituality and their religions, with people with 17 arms and things like that. And they morphed it into that's what these people are. So there was this completely false narrative about what the Eastern religions, what the Eastern spirituality, and what the Eastern people were and what they represented. And Marco, rather than writing a book about his stories, wrote a book about what he saw the Asian populations, the Mongolian Empire, those people, what they were doing and how they were living their life.
Yeah, it is a book that's not full of fantasy. It's just the facts, Jack, as they say. And it's interesting because it's written in kind of a comically long-winded and disorganized style. That's what Lester says. And here's an example, Zach. He says, "Now let us leave these regions and turn to the Black Sea. It is true that there are many merchants and others who know it well, but still there are a great many more who do not know it. So for their sake, it is worthwhile to set down the facts in writing. Let us begin then with the mouth of the Black Sea, the Strait of Constantinople. At the entrance to the sea, on the western side, stands a mountain called the Faro. But now that we have embarked on this topic, we have had second thoughts about setting it down in writing. For, after all, it is very well known to many people. So let's drop the subject and start on another one." All right, that's in the book. That's what he wrote. So, this is not, I guess he could, maybe he needs a good editor, Zach, just like I, on the podcast, need a good, editor.
Yeah, or maybe the fact that it was the 1200s and formal writing, education, and books and those type of things didn't really have a existence. Really, they were just kind of people's thoughts thrown together, and what you had is what you had. You're going to learn something from it eventually, but it's not all going to be the most educational and compelling things to read.
Right. That there was very few people were literate, right? And so there was the idea of being able to write good literature when very few people could read or write. It's that's kind of a tough thing. And all of this was written by hand, right? There was no movable type at this point. Around 1300, this wasn't the case. So it's important about Marco's book is that he doesn't describe like what they might call monstrous races or fantastic beasts or warrior tribes. Instead, he describes a wealthy, powerful, populous, extensive, and technologically advanced and civilized world in the East, one with more wealth and more power, more population, technology, and civilization than the Europeans had ever expected. Right? The power and wealth of the Khan are evident throughout his book, throughout Marco Polo's book. He elevates the Khan to a very high level. He talks about the East being sophisticated and powerful, very civilized, large masses of people living there outside of Islam, outside of Christianity, outside of the West. And he shows tremendous reverence for the Khan. And you would think that he spent 17 years working for this guy. You would think that he has this reverence for him, and he presents him perhaps as the greatest and richest and most benevolent and most powerful king ever. These are qualities that become essentially the model for Christian kingship, right? If you're going to be a king in the West, you should behave the way Marco Polo describes the Khan in the East.
Yeah, I mean, that is true. I'm going back to something you mentioned earlier about the wealth of the Mongolian Empire. We talked about this before with the vastness of it being the largest landmass empire. The British Empire does not count because 90% of it was water. That does not count. I can own water. There's a lot of water.
You drink water.
That's cheating. Yeah, I even know how to drink water. It's not that hard. Regardless, the landmass that the Mongolian Empire had, that the Khans were in control of, that they were able to split and change and to sector out and be able to have stability across those sectors without political infighting that you see in city-states. You look at the Holy Roman Empire in Germany, which was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, because they were always fighting with each other, trying to get power, trying to change things. The same thing happened in Russia. The same thing happened in England for the most part. There was stability with the crown, but there was still so much infighting with little cities here and there. The Eastern world, before what we think of as the rise of imperialization and cities themselves with the Enlightenment, were already doing that. They had wealth with gold and money and sophisticated technology. We've talked about technology before and how the Greeks and the Romans, they were flourishing with technology and doing so many fun and inventive things with that. The Mongolian Empire was doing the same thing. They were just 1,000 years later. And there's so much of history forgets the fact that there were these great things coming from the East that was not just based in people ransacking and being vandals and this distorted view that so many of us have maybe heard on some level.
Yeah, we tend to view the Mongols as just brutal warriors, right? Barbarians, the wrath of God, Gog and Magog, as they are called, referencing to the Bible.
Is also true because their army was just ridiculous.
Right, and that was their army, but the army was on the outskirts of this civilization.
The people inside the civilization, protected by the army that will kill you for breathing, we're just people living lives and being able to prosper. Which is something we really haven't seen in history since the Hellenistic age, brought on by Alexander the Great.
Yeah, this world that Marco Polo describes, the wealth of the East, I mean, that fed right into the desires of the merchants in the West contemplating doing business with the East. All right. He writes of this city called Zayton, which today is I have such trouble with these city names. Quanzhou, right? He says this. The city, Marco Polo says, is the port for all ships that arrive from India, laden with costly wares and precious stones of great price, and pearls of fine quality. And I assure you that for one spice ship that goes to Alexandria or elsewhere to pick up pepper for export to Christendom, Zaytan is visited by 100 ships. I can tell you further that the revenue accruing to the Great Khan from this city and this port is something colossal. So he's saying if you think about what comes from the east to the west, it is multiplied 100-fold there in the empire of the Khan. He points to, he talks about 700,000 Eastern Christians living in the province of Manzi. Right, the Polos convinced the Khan. They said, "Hey, Khan, there's some Christians living out here. We want them to have all the privileges that other Christians do." And so they were very influential in getting like Western ideas into the East, and then bringing Eastern ideas back to the West. Right, and these cities had everything that the Western cities had: craftsmen and doctors, astrologers, magistrates. Right, not just commercial wealth, Zach. They had, like you pointed out, they had cultural wealth. Right, the city of Hangzhou, which was called Kinsai back then, was he says is the finest and most splendid city in the world. He said it has everything. He said it means, the city name means city of heaven, crisscrossed by a vast network of streets and canals and bridges, like Venice. The city has 10 principal marketplaces. 3 times a week, 40 to 50,000 merchants arrive at each market, bringing with them an impossible abundance of game, fruits, and vegetables of all kinds, great quantities of fish, and much more. Surrounding the markets are shops in which every craft imaginable is practiced, and every sort of luxury is on sale, including spices, gems, and pearls. This is not a backwater civilization that is living in tents and has a tough guy just running around slaughtering people on the outside. This is a highly advanced cultural civilization.
Yeah, they are doing things, they are surviving in something that looks like a very modern world. You can compare this to something like New York in the 18 and 1900s, like this, the way it was a bustling metropolis of people coming in, being able to have, opportunities to buy whatever you want and whatever you could think of. The opportunity was there. And then you mentioned it earlier about the merchants in the West, about the idea of going east and be able to trade, which restarted the idea of the Silk Road, which was something of antiquity, which again goes back to the time of Alexander the Great. So what we're seeing the Mongolian Empire create and sustain is something that existed before and fell off, and they were able to recreate and rebuild through that military prowess, but also with the freedom of the people to be able to live and prosper the way they did.
Yeah, you got to have the merchants doing merchant stuff. Now, I got to believe that there was, the Khan got very wealthy because the people got wealthy and he takes tax revenue from them. I mean, I got to believe that there was heavy duty taxation, and that's probably a lesson for another day is what was the government like there in the Mongolian Empire? What did it do under the Khans? How did they
survive and prosper?
Right. And what did they provide for the citizenry? What did the citizen provide for the government? So the descriptions that Marco Polo presents gives this picture in the West of this tremendous allure and sophistication of China and the East. And we still have that today. I mean, there's this, like the West has always looked to the East as a sophisticated and elegant and alluring civilization. And Marco Polo did nothing to dispel any of that. He only helped cement that. He talks about Japan, which he calls Chipangu, or the land of the rising sun, which is the first description of Japan in the West. Now, he never visited Japan, but he does point out it's 1,500 miles east of China. It's very large, and it's also very, very rich. Right? He talks about thousands of islands in the Indies. So he got sent on these these expeditions and explorations and trade merchants things into the Indies, he talks about he describes, quote, a surprising inhabited island of Sumatra. And if you can find Sumatra on a map, I think most people have heard of Sumatra. And he says what is surprising about it is so far south that the pole star is not visible there, right? And the importance to this is that Marco Polo realized that, yes, indeed, people did live in the torrid zone around the equator and south of the equator. Now, we talked about this a while back about these zones that the geographers of old had installed on the globe. And Marco Polo notes that, look, there are people living here on Sumatra, and it is south of the equator because you can't see the pole star there. And this is a thing that the West had long questioned. They were like, is it possible for the Antipodes, right? The people who stand with their feet, podes, anti, on the other side of the planet. Can there be
like
people
Australia,
on the other
upside down?
Right, upside down. Are they standing like they do in Australia on their heads, right? So they had this question, all right? So was there land south of the equator? Nobody really knew in the West there at that time. Was the whole Earth a TO map, or was there more to it than that? Okay. Now, St. Augustine's Act, there's a topic for another day, right? In the 5th century, all right, so it'd be 700 years before Marco Polo. He doubted the Antipodes. He didn't think that could be there. But Isidore of Seville, not the barber of Seville, but Isidore, his brother, all right, in the 6th century, 100 years later, he refuted Augustine. He thought there would be Antipodes, all right? And Marco Polo weighed in for the West on the side of Isidore and said, hey, yeah, you can't see the pole star. We've got to be south of the equator, and therefore there must be Antipodes.
And therefore our worldview of the world is shifting and changing. And instead of saying that, oh my God, fake news, they researched this stuff and they thought of intelligent things to say to be able to support this new education and understanding of the world that is ever expanding, because they didn't have smartphones. They had what they believed and what they were able to research and understand. And by going past the pole and not being able to see the North Star, they realized that, well, there is now a world that we did not know existed, and we get to explore this and to chase this. And again, that goes back to, Christopher Columbus and the sailing west from Europe and finding a way to get to, the Indies quicker and faster is something, that this spawned and this idea came from, along with the fact that, there's the Silk Roads tracing from the east to the west, providing all these goods and spices and things like that. All of this stuff is now coming together, and you're realizing why these people were going on these adventures and explorations. It's because there was so much more world to come after and to find, and they were chasing that.
Yeah, it's interesting. This is prior to this is like he was doing this prior to 1300. Okay, so it was still prior to 1300. So it's like 500 years prior to the American Revolution. This was a long time ago, so there was a lot of knowledge that got gained. It's not like these people were stupid. It's just that they just didn't
know it existed.
Right. And so they adjusted their worldview. Marco Polo came home in 1295, like we said, and he died in 1324. So about 30 years later, after he came back to Italy, he died. Now, some people were kind of skeptical of him, like, really? There's this great civilization over there. There's this Kublai Khan guy. Yeah, that he got criticism for that, but all the historical record from the East points to Kublai Khan being a real historic figure, ruling over much of China and much of the Mongol territory from about 1260 to right before Polo came back in 1295. All right. Now, in 1258, the Mongols had been ready to capture the entire Islamic world. They had gotten as far as Baghdad. They had captured Baghdad in 1258, but the Egyptians had pushed the Mongols back out of the Middle East. All right, and because the Mongols got pushed out of the Middle East, the Mongols turned their sights farther west and not south, and that's where they started interacting with Western Europe. Over those 30 years from 1260 to like 1290 or so, the Mongols' interaction with the Christians in the West became increasingly more friendly. Okay, and what happened is what started off in the mid part of the 1200s, like around 1250, when everybody was freaking out that the Mongols were over there, they became increasingly friendly with the relations between the Mongols and the Europeans. And by the late 1200s, everything was going great. All right, Marco Polo was in the court during that time in the late 1200s, and things opened up between Europe and the East. The Franciscans, all right, the religious order, they worked really hard to get into the East. By 1318, okay, so Marco Polo's back about 1300. By 1318, the Franciscans had over 34 monasteries in Mongol territory, and they had at least four of them in China. Okay. And these missionaries, they wrote down what they saw, and that information made it back. Okay. And they influenced Western thought about the East for generations. All right. So there was all this optimism in the early 1300s about the possibilities for this, like, wow, look, there are all these people out there. We can convert these people. We'll save their souls. If you're a missionary, like, we'll save their wallets. We'll grab their, we'll open up trade. And everything was a great time of like Pax Mongola. All right. This was a peaceful time of trade. All right. In 1340, the route from west to east was considered, quote, perfectly safe, whether by day or by night. This was not a risky operation anymore by 1340, from the Black Sea all the way to China. All right. Here's the quote. Even among those who didn't travel, a kind of Mongol chic developed, born of a growing interest in the Far East. Nobles commissioned lavish editions of Marco Polo's book for their libraries. Italian parents began the process of naming their children after Mongol Khans. Mongol captives became some of the most popular class of slaves. On one memorable occasion in 1344, Zach, King Edward III of England, that's about as far west as you can get, right, held a tournament in which all of the participants were gaily bedecked in Mongol garb. So there was like the Mongols, it was a chic thing to be. It was like the fashionable thing to be in the mid 1300s.
Yeah, you used the term Pax Mongolica, which I think you were using it as a made-up term, which is actually a historical reference to the rise of the Mongolian Empire, the power of it that I have mentioned since we started this Marco Polo series. So you were not making up a term. You were adequately describing the fact that the Mongolian Empire, the relationships that they were able to curate with parts of the West, and to have that civilization known to parts of the West, and people wanted to be a part of that, it existed. The Mongolian culture, Mongolian ideas, Mongolian technology and advancement and names became a thing not just for the East, but also for the West. This idea of Pax Mongolia, very much so like Pax Romania, which is a common term that you hear in references to the Roman Empire, which we have talked about before, but was instead a reference to this new Mongolian Empire in the 1200s and through the start of the bubonic plague, of this changing in civilization, of this changing in the way the world interacted with each other, because, like I mentioned before, this strong military prowess allowed the people to prosper. And when the people prospered, there was so much more growth and change with the technology and the advancement of the world, and that went west as the empire got bigger and stronger.
Yeah, this is a thing that before I started doing this research into Marco Polo, I had always heard of Pax Romana, and I looked that up, and I came to understand what it means. Right, is that when Rome was very strong, everybody who was in Rome benefited from that strength that was there. But I had never really heard. I mean, I knew the Mongols were there. Like, I learned that Mongolia was this place, very barren desert. That's where. You ever heard of Roy Chapman Andrews, Zach?
Yep.
All right. He was the guy who discovered dinosaur eggs. All right. And I heard of like this place. This is how I learned of Mongolia, is I read these Roy Chapman Andrews stories. Here's a guy we could do an episode on. He went searching for dinosaur eggs, and he found them in Mongolia. You know where he found them in Mongolia?
Just hanging out.
Yeah, they were sitting on the ground. All right. Mongolia is so barren that he found dinosaur eggs still sitting on the ground. All right. That's how much the world didn't change there. Right. But I never really heard or understood that this powerful, powerful military empire had driven a whole series of, how should I say it? It drove the Pax Mongolia. It drove a time of peace and lots of trade, cultural exchange, and it really opened up the East to the West. And everything was going great until what, Zach?
The rats came, the bubonic plague, which I already mentioned. While we're on this idea of talking about Pax Romana and Pax Mongolia, there were also Pax Britannia and Pax Americana and Pax Ottoman Empire and putting your feet up. That's actually a thing. It's Pax Ottomanan. But there's these ideas of these cultural and societal changes where there's peace and stability that allows people to prosper and grow. The Mongolian Empire allowed that to happen. Despite the fact that we mentioned earlier that they were brutal and mean and terrible and everyone, and they're depicted terribly through most media, they were not that because they created a flourishing empire. If we're going to hail the Roman Empire as great and cool and things like that, you better be talking about the Mongolian Empire because, well, if we're being honest here, the Roman Empire is kind of lame when you compare it to the Mongolian Empire.
I'll give you that. I used to hold the Romans in pretty high regard, and
then you started hanging out with me.
I started hanging out with you, doing this podcast for a year, and now I'm realizing we still live in a Greek culture, right? We're kind of barbarians living in the ruins of a great culture, right? Right, and there were other ones, and I learned that the Mongols drove this from the middle of nowhere. They ran all of Asia. Now, the Mongols eventually lost power there. The Muslims were able to push them out of the Middle East, all right, and they also pushed out the Latins out of the Middle East. And the Chinese eventually got sick of the Mongols in 1368, and they pushed them out of China. All right, and with that, Western merchants and missionaries got kicked out as well. So you put the rats on the rats were the fleas, and on the fleas were the plague. Right. And then you have the Muslims pushing out the Mongols, and you have the Chinese pushing out the Mongols. And then you have the Confucians taking control again in China, and they closed down China, and the Muslim world closed up inside itself. And it wasn't until the late 1400s, Zach, when Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Certain Death and sailed over to India in about 1498, that things opened back up again between East and West. But prior to 1370 or so, things were great. Then they go through about 120 years or so of
I would say there's
some
an argument
downside.
Made it's closer to 300 years.
All right, go.
So the bubonic plague happened. It shut down the trade, and the Mongolian Empire shrinks. It becomes what we now know as Mongolia today. Other countries kind of fill in: the Persian Empire, the Ottoman Empire. There's other empires that are kind of taking up that spot, and that trade and that prosper that the Silk Road allowed and provided for didn't prosper both sides, the East and the West. It wasn't until 300 years later when China began opening up again, and they began trading with the Eastern and the Western world, that the trade and the prosper that the Mongolian prosperity that the Mongolian Empire allowed to flourish was able to flourish again. And that was the 1700s. So that was a long time. And by the time we're in the 1700s, there's new technological advances. There's the whole North America and South America, and the Native Americans that were there, the incoming colonies of Spain, Portugal, Britain, Netherlands. Choose
France.
Your favorite country that
France.
was probably doing. I always forget about France. And then there's a lot of change and shift going on, and the world is in a different place by the time everything is able to be opened up again.
Yeah, it is. Looking back on this, and it's interesting because I read this a couple times. Did the research on it, and I even wrote up these notes, Zach. But it wasn't until discussing this with you fully that I've really come to see this. Why aren't we taught? about Pax Mongolia. I think it's a piece that's missing out of understanding the a global trade and the history of the West and the East. I'm glad we were able to do it, Zach, here on Buff Nagel the podcast. All right, so maybe we should change the name this week to like Mongol Nagel the podcast or something. Okay, we won't do that. We'll leave it the way it is. All right, it's Buff Nagel the podcast. But anyway, it's a phenomenal story, and Marco Polo, unfortunately, is I want to say unfortunately he's a small part of it. He's a big part of it, but his story is just a part of this bigger Mongol story that needs to be told.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it. I mentioned earlier the Mongols are really given a bad rap throughout history. Marco Polo, in his book, in his in his writings and what he was able to pass on, gave the East a new, better light, and people were able to prosper from that. But still today, in history classes and things like that, if you're not going in and doing the research and learning about these things, you're going to think that the Mongols were bad and Mulan was good and saved the day, and whatever other Disney story or whatever other movie.
Is that the Mulan story? Is that when does she kick out? Is she the one?
I think she kills Genghis Khan. Is I think what the story alludes to, but I don't know. They have some good music, and that's what we're going to say about that. But you mentioned it, Marco Polo. He did a good thing by going east, connecting with the Khan, and allowing that flourish and that trade to happen because he provided that education and the new understanding of how big the world was. But people talk about, oh yeah, Marco Polo, without realizing the fact that Marco Polo was not just a guy who went east and came back with new information. He did stuff. He put in the work and he showed up and he expanded the world by doing the hard thing.
Yeah, and you know what? And he wrote it down. All right. And I guess that's, that may be a lesson for you guys. I think we talked about this last time, Zach, is, you know what? Write your stories down. All right. That's one reason we do this podcast, to get people's stories told. And if you got a story, and we have a number of them coming up that you want to get told, hey, let us know. We will, we'll see what we can, how we can help you out and get you out there. Zach, that's Marco Polo. That's the end of the Mongols. We are now up into the, I don't know. We're in kind of
we're hanging out with the Black Plague. We're going to interview some rats next week.
We're going to do the plague. We're going to be wearing, and we're in our own little plague these days. So, but we got to Vasco da Gama. He sailed around the Cape of Certain Death, and that may be a story for another day. The things that he was able to do for Portugal. Zach, that's Marco Polo and the Mongols.
Yeah, that is Marco Polo and the Mongols. Thank you all for tagging along and listening to this story. We could talk probably more and go in more depth about the Mongolian Empire, kind of the things they did and the technology advances they did. That might come in the future. We have a bunch of other history things that we're going to get to in the future as well. But as always, thank you all for listening. Remember to go seek the good, be the good, and spread the good. Enjoy the adventure of life.